Welcome everybody to another episode of the Roundtable. Luke here again today with my good friend Ghost and two guests today from CHEQD. We have Fraser Edwards, the CEO, and Alex Tweeddale, who is the head of governance and compliance at CHEQD. Thank you guys for joining us. And before we get into it, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, somehow find myself as the CEO of CHEQD, and kind of thrilled to be kind of teammates with Alex and the rest of the team. Are obviously kind of beavering away in the background. Prior to this, I was working with the World Economic Forum and the Dutch and Canadian governments on the CHEQD project. So stands for Known Traveller Digital Identity. And ultimately, it's building self-sovereign ID, which we'll get onto in a second, for international travel. Somewhat it was the precursor of what IATA are doing with their travel pass, and we may touch on that in the call as well. And prior to that, was really lucky to be working with a couple of central banks on cross-ledger payments, so part of the Jasper Ubin project. So somehow, by a mix of like jumping around technologies and jumping around different roles from architecture to delivery, somehow come out with the perfect like background and skill set and kind of knowledge to be building out an incentivized SSI network. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex.
Oh, no, thanks, Fraser. That was a good intro. So I'm Alex Tweeddale, and I'm working as the head of compliance and governance here at CHEQD. I come from a legal background, actually, so I studied law, but I ended up writing my master's thesis on this new technology called SSI, which was sort of creeping up in the sort of blockchain world. Since then, I jumped into the startup world, and I've worked for a couple of identity startups. Most notably, the last company I worked for, I was a product manager across a really big project with the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of the biggest SSI sort of initiatives at the moment. So that was really exciting. And now I've joined CHEQD, and I'm ready to get going and start building this governance framework, which I'm sure we'll get onto later as well.
Just incredible
Back to you,
backgrounds.
Luke.
Oh, well, excuse me. Sorry, Alex, and Luke. But I just want to say these are some incredible backgrounds we just heard from both Fraser and Alex. Fraser with KDTI and also Jasper Ubin. Just really great stuff for fundamentally building the RTGS system for identity. And Alex, the fact that you had any experience with the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of the leading adoption vectors for DIDs and VCs, is incredible. And we can get into like what that experience means perhaps later. So go ahead, Luke.
Sure, I was just going to say, before we get into the nitty gritties, you guys are both based in the UK. London, is it?
Yep, both in the UK, or at least for now. I think we've been slightly remote and probably will continue to be in the future. I think that's one of the benefits of this whole brave new world. But yeah, currently both in the UK, in London.
Awesome. I bet what's the weather like over there? Any good?
You already know the answer. Like you didn't even need me to answer the question. You know,
True.
Everyone knows.
Well, at least you're not on fire.
That is a big plus. Rain, constant rain is better than constant fire. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah. Luke has a perspective to bring on that one for sure.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, derailing a little bit, but anyway, before we get into what you guys are building specifically at CHEQD, could you guys give us a bit of a background on what is self-sovereign identity and what are maybe some of the use cases and the industries in which it'll find its best market fit? Because I think a lot of people in the crypto space especially aren't particularly used to SSI and the terminology and what it actually means in a literal sense. So perhaps before we get into CHEQD, you guys could just give us a rundown on what is the SSI industry.
Alex, do you want to take a fun crack, and then I'll see if I can.
I'll take a fun crack. Yeah. So the way I love to think about SSI is it's reframing how data is controlled. So at the moment, if we think about where our data is stored, especially in a digital way, we have so many accounts just scattered across the internet and the metaverse, across all our social media platforms, across everywhere where we buy something online, all our online banking. And all of those digital profiles are inherently controlled by those companies that monetize our own data. And SSI is about reframing that and saying, actually, no, this is my data that you guys are all controlling in all these different silos. And SSI is about bringing back control to you. So on my phone, in a digital wallet, I could hold verified information about myself, sort of authentic data, as we like to call it, that says, this bank has attested that I am Alex Tweeddale, and now I can prove that fact to Ghost or to Luke or to anyone, to a certain attribute about myself. So it's basically streamlining the ability to identify yourself in a physical and digital domain using a digital identity. Fraser, anything to add?
I think only just a lot of people use like SSI or self-sovereign ID. Like the other terms that a lot of people may know it by are like decentralized ID, or even self-managed ID. I've seen kind of floating, and even longer, like before, like user-centered ID seems to be a term that was used. I think a really good way I've seen of people visualizing what it means is like in GDPR, where you have a data controller and a data processor, and there's a really big headache of being a data controller, which typically companies are, and they actively try and avoid it. And one of the beauties of SSI is it moves the kind of data controller to the individual. And I think one of the things that's only recently hit me in terms of kind of understanding, which really should have been obvious from the start, is to Alex's point around those data silos. And where historically, like all of that data was in kind of different companies and maybe was in different industries and therefore was completely separated. One of the beauties of SSI is actually it brings all of that data together onto the individual. And then I think, Luke, to your kind of question on like industries and use cases, a perfect example of this is for international travel. And the work that Evanim and IATA are doing on kind of travel passes. And I think that's a perfect example of SSI. That's where they've combined data from kind of 3 different organizations or types of organization. So they've taken passports from a government, they've taken lab tests or vaccine passports from healthcare, and they've taken boarding passes from airlines. And they've put all of that onto a mobile under the control of the individual. And it means that like the experience is super seamless from both the user perspective and the airline's perspective and the boarder's perspective. But they've not had to like keep it in a data silo with the airline, where like airlines don't want to be touching health data. Like it's one of like the worst things that they could be doing from a data security perspective. But like having individuals take ownership of that and decide what they can kind of receive and what they can share is perfect. So I think that's like a prime example of like an SSI use case where they've taken data from multiple places, wrapped it with like, it needs to be trusted, it needs to be under the control of the individual, and the user experience needs to be amazing, and wrapped all of that together. I think, Alex, you've probably got some user experience or like some other use cases that you've worked on recently that are kind of relevant here as well.
Yeah, and just coming on from that point, I think the use cases for SSI are rapidly expanding. It sort of started off with this idea of reclaiming your own data. But now with these sort of new technical standards which have been created under the guise of the World Wide Web Consortium, we're seeing not only the ability to control your own data, but just trusted and authentic data in general. So, for example, the project I was working on with the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, they weren't doing anything to do with a user controlling identity. But what the project was about, it was about verified identity of like products and packages at different stages in the supply chain life cycle. So the idea being that you've got a supply chain, say in e-commerce, you've got a manufacturer, you've got a distributor, you've got maybe an airline that's moving like a product along the supply chain. And if you could have verified and signed data for that product at each stage in the supply chain, and it's all in the same interoperable data format, you can actually streamline a lot of things, especially for US customs. So not only is SSI about controlling your data, it's also about just authentic, signed and verified data and how you can use that going forward as well.
So would you say like this this sort of what is the data standard? GSMA, right? Who did the barcodes? Would they be involved in this sort
GS1.
of GS1? Sorry, yeah, GS1. So this is kind of like a DID/VC enabled barcode that can transport not only the actual good, but also the digital twin of the payload of metadata or whatever like the identity handle, etc., across borders. Like SSI,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
And we were working with GS1 to sort of retrofit the GTIN identifier that you have on products and packages, and link that with verifiable credentials, which is the data standard used for SSI, to create this sort of digital twin, as you said, that you can trace along the supply chain. So
Now,
the use cases for this technology are sort of growing and almost endless, which is exciting.
I think goes to your example, like I think that's where you can start seeing how it's replicating the physical world into a digital world. Like a great example that I keep seeing being used to like explain SSI is like you wouldn't have to go and ask someone for access to your passport to go and share it to someone. So why would you do that with any of your other data? And I think that's like the personal identity side, but like you were saying, when you look at say barcodes or kind of other identifiers or even like IoT or into virtual beings or virtual things, like they all start having like comparisons between current physical world where it kind of works into a digital one where it doesn't necessarily yet because all the data is being stored centrally. So I think your example around barcodes is like a perfect example for like physical goods moving around and their need to prove themselves and where they came from. Like it's exactly the same, just that should be in a digital format instead.
the only difference I would think for the physical good comparison and the user-centric SSI vision is being that the user can choose whether or not to use a certain set of data to represent themselves. Whereas in this use case, it seems like the item that's being represented as a digital twin like is being, how do you say, steward for, like kind of like a parent-child relationship.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think like longer term, you could see them becoming more and more autonomous of like being able to recognize who they were sharing data to and therefore like what information they would have to share. Like a great example from ages ago is, and I can't remember the company that did this, but they looked at the number of data points that you need to move something across the world, both physically and from like a trade finance perspective.
Mhm.
And broadly speaking, a lot of the data was the same regardless of who you were speaking to, but there were some nuances. And I think like the longer, the more mature the technology becomes, the more it will turn into actually all of this is core and everyone needs to know about it. But actually, there's certain stuff that only needs to go to a customs official. There's only certain stuff that needs to go to a bank, and therefore only expose it to people who have a certain kind of type of identity.
Mhm.
And I think that's where some of it could get really, really cool longer term is having cars with the autonomous ability to only share payment details to a toll booth, but not to someone who's just showing up with like to try and like get money off the car. So I think that's where it gets really, really interesting longer term is once you start. I think a lot of the immediate use cases will be for people. I think, and probably companies. I think where it's going to become fascinating longer term is like IoT and virtual things where actually we can make these things autonomous or more autonomous than they are now and open up just this whole other world that we've not even considered.
Yeah, so it sounds like then like the choice of running a DLT infrastructure, uh, such as checked, is the natural extension of facilitating this autonomous future, where you have this ledger that exists independent of third parties. It is as neutral as it possibly can be, facilitating this identity-based utility trans domains. Like so, using these DID and VC-based specs in order to reach differing jurisdictional domains, different platforms, different users, etc., etc. Is that the vision here?
Absolutely. And I think it probably starts with some of Alex's work now, which is kind of taking the network itself towards a DAO. I won't kind of steal your thunder here, Alex, because it's entirely your work.
Okay, if we're getting on to DAOs and decentralized governance now, then it's right up my alley. Um, what we are trying to build at CHEQD is basically a network where we don't want to have control of the network. We don't want to be held accountable for what happens on the network. We want to build something that grows exponentially into a decentralized, autonomous ledger, so that anyone can use it and there's absolute security on there, but none of the node operators nor participants in the network can be pointed at by the SEC or any sort of regulator to say, you're liable for X, Y, and Z that's happened on the network. And this is the sort of framework that I'm trying to build out right now. It's how do we get from this starting point and launching a blockchain or a layer 1 utility to the point where, okay, we've got these genesis parameters, obviously we've got a lot of control at the beginning, to then the end state where we don't have any sufficient control over the network. We are just like any other node operator or user on the network, and accountability, liability, and I guess trust is spread out through the entirety of the network itself. So yeah, that's my job, is figuring out how that works.
Oh, easy.
Yeah, simple as pie. I mean, Alex, would it be simple to say also that you're striving to create a minimal viable politics?
A minimal viable politics, yeah.
Yes.
I guess you could put that forward. I think, and that probably leads on quite nicely onto this concept that I've created called entropy, which is actually how you can calculate decentralization across the network, which is really fascinating. So I like to think of it, as we start the network, we've got this very low entropy state, which is we've put in the structure, the order is very low entropy. But actually, you can model how entropy increases as more node operators join. The ability for node operators to make a decision on the network gets more spread out through a collective. And as entropy goes from low entropy to high entropy, we're actually going to pinpoint checkpoints in the network where we can say, okay, we've reached like level 2 of sufficient decentralization.
Was that an intentional pun? Was that an intentional pun?
Oh, checkpoints.
Yes.
They always fall into it.
Okay, keep going.
I like to think of this as like a rocket ship. So if you imagine a rocket and it's stuck on the ground, it's got its big thrusters on, and it's about to take off. So that's like us. We are Elon Musk making this rocket take off from the ground. And as it starts to take off, it needs support from these two big thrusters on the side, until it gets into the stratosphere. And as it gets into the stratosphere, gradually the rocket doesn't need support of its thrusters anymore. And we checked that the thrusters can slowly detach from this rocket, and it can launch and it can carry on by itself straight through the stratosphere into space and into the cosmos by itself.
The cosmos.
And that's the sort of the cosmos, another pun in there.
Yes.
And that's the sort of the network, decentralized governance framework and network that we're trying to create here.
Luke, do you have any questions about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Fraser.
No. So I think I think to go back to where it started off of like minimum viable politics as well. I think something that Alex is doing that's probably very different to like a lot of traditional governance models, and I think it'll be the same way that we explain our tokenomics, is like just putting it into plain English. Like a lot of governance frameworks are so impenetrable and so hard to read. And I think what I particularly enjoyed about watching what Alex is building out now is just like it's very easy to understand, and it's written for lay people to understand, to the point where anyone can turn up and participate and understand what they're contributing to and the impact of it. And I think that kind of aligns with our ethos of like public permissionless, but also just like this longer term view of involving as many people as possible to help direct the network. Like one of the big benefits of SSI is really it puts the individual back in control, and therefore longer term, like there is an incentive to have a more for individuals to actually care about the underlying network and how it's directed, because it'll have a direct impact on their day-to-day lives. Like, I think that's one of the big benefits we have from a marketing perspective, is like we really are empowering everyone to get their data back and have control of it in the way that they want to. And really that becomes kind of all encompassing to what we're doing. And yeah, I'd say Alex's kind of plain English approach to governance is a great example of that.
So
I just
Go ahead, Luke.
sorry guys.
No,
I just
no,
wanted to touch on one point. So we talked about SSI and we talked about you guys trying to build an open network. CHEQD. I was wondering if you could maybe just walk through some, like, in a literal sense, like, what does that look like? How do we go from, you know, verifying your ID in like a bottle or getting on an airplane to, you know, that being on chain? You know, like, can you guys just walk us through maybe some of those steps? Like, how is the network going to be structured?
Sure. Alex, keep me correct here, but like, I think one of the misconceptions about SSI is that the data lives on Ledger. And there are still some like networks that do that. Most of the kind of better ones have moved away from it. It's certainly stuff that the SSI kind of vendor group as a whole has moved away from probably 2 or 3 years ago. And the reasons largely for that were like avoiding any issues with GDPR. Like, it was like, it's still a gray area. It's just not something you want to get involved in, like with having to fight between an immutable ledger and a person's right to be forgotten. So most people have moved away from it, and that means that for the majority of SSI solutions, or at least the kind of more standards-based, like higher quality ones, like all the data is going peer-to-peer and going off ledger. So it's a lot more like, say, a BitTorrent model than it is kind of routing via the ledger. And that means actually there's very, very little on the ledger, like really kind of small amounts. And broadly speaking, it breaks down to kind of inside the W3C world, did specs, did docs, credential schemas, credential definitions, and then revocation registries. And to like run through those really simplistically, like DIDs are like decentralized identifiers. You get 2 classes of those. You get private and public. The private ones don't go on the ledger at all. They're between organizations and individuals, vice versa, and individuals. But public DIDs are kind of the decentralized identifiers for typically organizations, and they do reside on the ledger, and they come with things called DID docs, which Alex knows a lot more about than me. But the next categories of those things are kind of credential definitions and credential schemas. Like credential schemas, if I remember correctly, are global. So it's almost like the global definition of what a passport looks like. A definition is then actually the UK one now has a dark blue cover rather than the old burgundy one. And then the final thing that kind of goes onto there is a thing called a revocation registry. Some ledgers have them, some don't. Ultimately, though, what that structure provides is whether a credential, when it's issued, VC is issued, whether that credential is still valid or not. A great example would be with passports. If you issue them, people do lose them. So it makes sense to have the ability to revoke a passport even before the kind of expiry date. The beauty about the revocation registry, and going back to like not having data on the ledger, is actually the revocation registry doesn't include any personal information at all. It doesn't even include the wallet to which the credential was issued to. It's just this cryptographic accumulator, this kind of structured number that defines whether a credential is valid or not. So all of that kind of means that there's very, very little on the ledger, and everything is kind of moving around on top. Now, where that starts moving into the payments world, it gets a bit more complex, and obviously you do start having kind of payments routing around. And that's kind of where we're building right now, is moving from like the old school kind of the ledger is just a repository for like the identity like primitives, if we're going to use Amazon language, through to like being able to be what Ghost described as the real-time gross settlement system for identity. I think Alex has a point here.
Yeah, I just want to take a step back. I think it's probably going to be quite important for the listeners just to run through like how the ledger, the credentials, and the DIDs sort of interact in like a real life scenario, giving an example. Because I think
Alex,
quite
are you
often
gonna talk about the trust triangle?
I am going to talk about the
Yes.
trust
Beautiful,
triangle.
beautiful. You got it.
Because I think it's a really important thing to explain at this point, because otherwise things can get a little bit confusing. So I'm going to take an example where, Fraser, you can be the bank, I will be the holder of credentials, and Ghost, you can be an airline who I want to show my credentials to. Okay, so what happens with SSI is Fraser, the bank, will issue me a credential that says I am Alex Tweeddale. And the way that I can verify that that was issued by Fraser is because that credential will be signed by Fraser's DID, and that DID will be on the ledger. So there's a public DID which Fraser will sign my credential with, so that when I show that to Ghost, the airline, Ghost can go, okay, I've got this credential from Alex, and I can check that the DID in that credential is the same as what's on the ledger that identifies Fraser, the bank.
And it's still valid. It's not revoked.
Absolutely. So Fraser in this case is the issuer. I am the holder, and you are Ghost, the verifier. And this is the trust triangle.
That's the triangle.
It's being able to verify information from an issuer through to a holder to a verifier cryptographically using a distributed ledger. I just wanted to explain that point because I think it's really important for the listeners to understand before we move on into the more complex payment world. Is there any questions that you guys have at this point?
Well, I have an extension, I think, of what you're talking about, which I think is it ties back to, going back to how, these institutions, they don't really want to be the holders of the managers of someone else's identity. They've just had to have been due to previous architectural principles. And, they've monetized it, and they've built whole platforms now about, data monetization, data management, user management, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a freemium model, it's the Web 2.0 model. But in the sort of post-SSI world, and post-DLT enable SSI world in particular, we're seeing this cost, which has been monetized via exploitation, turn into a revenue stream. Where is that an appropriate way to look about this? Where like a bank in this case, which normally would be like, you looking at KYC as a problem for them to add on, it's an expense, can now via a tokenized trust triangle can actually turn that into potential revenue source. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think, but also that it gives people better user experiences as well. And I think also the longer this runs on, the more that there'll be kind of less of a need to hold certain types of data if you've gone through certain processes using that trusted data. Like a great example that I'd point to in the last weeks would be T-Mobile. Like if you could give T-Mobile the option to avoid the hack that they recently had, and all that they still had to kind of KYC people, but use trusted data. And once they've been through that process, as long as they could prove that they were following it, they didn't need to keep that data. I think they'd be over the moon. Obviously, it has like a benefit right now in terms of the ability to monetize, like you were saying, monetize that data and like market to people successfully and kind of try and upsell them. But I think if they could kind of merge that with also not having the risk of all the data they need to hold for KYC purposes, I think they'd really appreciate it. And I think it's very, very similar for banking, and it's the reason why it always gets brought up as a great use case for this. Is like it costs a lot of money to onboard someone to a bank account, and in the kind of world of low interest rates, it's one of the reasons why banks really don't want people moving around, because the cost of onboarding is so high that actually there's very little kind of potential to offer that individual positive services, because they simply need to make the revenue back just for onboarding them in the first place. And I think providing like some of the use cases that we've seen really allow like these organizations to give people back their data so that they can use them in very kind of more user-centric ways. Like to Luke's point, whether it's like walking into a bottle and being able to prove that you're over 18 without having to present a driving license that has your address on it and like your date of birth and everything, just being able to prove like it is you and you're over the age of like 18 or 21 would be so much better. And that's some of the use cases that are being looked at, which are just like, that's a very, very simple low value one. But there are much more complex ones where it builds on like real utility that previously wasn't possible.
Yeah, and you have like initiatives like just that are encouraging banks, that like open banking initiative from the UK, where it's basically saying, make your customers have the ability to transfer from one interface to another. And yet these banks, which are, like you're saying, we have incredibly low interest rates, the basis of their revenue system is just shot, the one they've depended on for hundreds of years, if not longer. They're going to have to innovate. And those new utilities you're talking about, facilitated by DLT, it's a whole new world for a whole new digital new world, so to speak. I wanted to briefly touch on, did T-Mobile have a relationship, or Deutsche Telekom have a relationship with Sovereign previously?
Oh, probably, but I'm not close enough to know. I've definitely, I'm sure I've seen their logo around, but yeah, Alex, I think you're closer.
I think a lot of telecommunications companies have got into sort of POCs with companies around this space, but I don't think anything has got past that yet. Except maybe in New Zealand, I know that there's some interesting work going on with some of the telecommunications providers there, which could be worth keeping an eye on, actually.
Yeah, it's really funny. I just looked it up. Deutsche Telekom is a sovereign steward of and has been since 2018. So the fact of this, it remains, is that if they had adopted SSI as an identity primitive as they could have like 3 years ago, they wouldn't be dealing with this hack.
Or at least like the data on their services would actually be like, because it'd be cryptographically kind of linked, at least like the utility of it would be slightly less. I think that's kind of the, like, I think they'd have still been vulnerable to like cyber attack, but I think like at least the data maybe wouldn't have been as useful, or maybe it just would have put them into a better space when like once you're dealing with data that's encrypted or like not always in clear, like you start kind of realizing that there's other vulnerabilities elsewhere. I guess the big thing for them, like they've somewhat got a similar problem to banks as well, in that like that onboarding process and the huge amounts of fraud that go on, really impacts their cost structure. Like, I can't remember which network it was, but one of the main problems they were having was people signing up for mobiles online with other people's credit cards, getting them delivered, and then never paying for them. And that's something that really, it's one of our kind of theorems longer term, is once we kind of drop the price of authentic data, actually, like, you open up so many more use cases. Like to call a company out that I think is doing this really well is Nuggets. And Nuggets was targeting like retail fraud and the ability to link like a payment card and a proof of address like into a retail experience, and show that like when you're ordering something, not only do you have the card, but you also have proof that you are the person who owns that card and lives at that address, just to reduce the sheer amount of fraud. Like if you're a telco and every time someone signs up for a phone with someone else's card, like you could, based on the price of an iPhone, be immediately out of like $1,000. And that's like, it's not bank money, but it's still significant, like really significant.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Minimizing fraud is a huge factor that could facilitate the adoption of SSI. It seems, Alex, you were about to say something.
No, I was going to point out that it also opens up opportunities in industries which currently can't afford to do identity verification, such as in like e-commerce. Like if I want to buy something, if I want to buy something off someone on the internet, No, we're not going down that route. If I want to buy something,
verifiable mail order brides. Oh my god.
Oh, this one bleak very quickly.
Okay, keep going, Alex.
no, but if I want to buy something off an e-commerce website, I have no idea that that e-commerce website is legitimate. I have no idea whether the product is legitimate. And there's no scope for the e-commerce website to do like very extensive identity checks on the seller because it's too much money. They don't have most of them don't have the capacity to do that. But if you could actually say to them, oh, you can do this identity check for, a fraction of a cent or a pence, then all of a sudden you're building all of this trust in a digital domain. And this probably comes on to what we're building at CHEQD and the sort of business model that we're looking at, going back to the trust triangle of issuer, holder, verifier. Fraser, do you want to explain that, the sort of business model from that perspective? You're probably best placed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of gets into what we've spoken about so far on like the value of that data and like the value of the trust that's been imbued in it or imbued to it by trusted organizations issuing it in the first place, like as part of that triangle. And like ultimately there's a massive benefit both on the kind of issuer of data side and on the ultimate receiver of that data in both their revenue and cost structures by being able to take in data fully digitally and in a fully digitally and like in a trusted format. Like if you're an issuer of that data, and to use kind of Alex's grouping before, kind of if I'm issuing data to Alex, as if I'm an organization or a bank or any other organization issuing data to Alex, like I don't know where Alex is going to use it, and therefore like he could realistically use that data anywhere else in the world with any other organization. But the beauty of kind of the W3 specs and kind of the work that's going underneath that is that when Alex shares that data to another organization, they can take it in a digital format rather than needing a physical document. So like rather than even needing, like obviously the old school version was you had to go into a branch and present documents or go to a physical touch point. Then it moved on to like scan a document and take a picture of yourself to do it. And the next level is like actually the data will have been issued to you digitally in a trusted format and you can then share it on in the future. And the beauty of kind of where this is ultimately going to is when that data is shared on in the future, it will be so much easier to consume for the end organization that it'll represent like a massive cost saving. So if we go back to that kind of bank example, because we know the numbers, like it costs them somewhere between 10 and 100 quid to like onboard someone. And a significant proportion of that is paying for providers to scan documents and like look at selfie checks. And sometimes it's literally going to a person who sits there looking at the two, comparing them together. And ultimately by moving away from that into like trusted documents, you can really drop that kind of that cost for onboarding. And the trade-off of that is obviously you become willing to actually pay that back to the issuer of that data. And that really like creates really interesting dynamics. So if you're the recipient of that data, the end recipient, like you're happy to pay a nominal cost because it's so much less than what you were paying before. Like you're dropping, say, a 10 to 100 quid cost down to like sub £1, sub $1, which is a whole different level.
Two orders of magnitude. 2 orders of magnitude lower.
Exactly. And the flip side though is that if you're an organization like issuing those issuing that data, then suddenly like once you've issued that data, as long as it's being used, you get a recurring revenue stream. So like the easiest example for most people to understand is a passport. Like you use it for everything from crossing borders to going into a bottle to use Luke's language. And like obviously they have like drastically different like values attached to them. Like crossing a border is about the highest trust activity that you can do from a government's perspective. But obviously going to a bottle is like considered much more transactional, much lower value. But at the same time, like each one of them has an associated value to it. And as the passport offers, you know that passport is being used for roughly 10 years. and therefore actually there was a recurring revenue stream coming back off it. And so then you can start looking across kind of multiple areas, like vaccine credentials, into proof of address, into like any kind of degree that you use to move between multiple jobs. Like, given how many fraudulent CVs there are out there, actually it makes sense to pay a nominal fee back to, say, a university to know that that person actually went, but also not have to go
a business, right? Like if you've worked somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, like they can attest.
Exactly.
This person who from Accenture, which Fraser, you worked from, they can attest that like Fraser definitely worked at Accenture. He definitely worked in the KDTI. He definitely worked at Jasper Rubin.
Exactly. Rather than just kind of, I think the stats in the US for like fraudulent CVs are terrifying, and I think it's just to Alex's point of like, once you drop that price, suddenly you can establish trust everywhere where it didn't exist before. And I guess to go back to like where we were starting originally, like there were massive impacts on not just bottom lines and top lines, but also we think on the network effect of SSI. Like if there is a monetary value to increasing revenue and dropping costs, then suddenly there's a massive incentive to go and expand the adoption. Like if you're an issuer, the more receivers of that data you have, the higher your revenue. If you're a receiver, the more issues you have, the lower your costs. So just like there's this massive like almost flywheel that we I think documented in the business models of SSI as a blog. And I think that's one of the things that we're really kind of looking forward to seeing is once this starts moving, it really will be a flywheel. I guess to finally close that off, we've already seen that once in a like one client conversation where I won't name what industry or like what organization, but they kind of came in and were like, we're really interested in where this is going. What's this going to look like? And we said, right, there's all this revenue, blah, 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 there's payments and stuff. And they went, oh, okay. We'll just bring everyone in our ecosystem then, because it's just a lot more efficient. And that's exactly the interaction we were looking for. Is like, it's not just us doing it. Like we're going to bring everyone and do it. That's kind of, I think, the transformation of moving it from like pure privacy tech into like a commercial decision. That's the cool. I realize I've rambled on a lot, but that's the coolest bit.
Well, can you at least share like the scale of how many people you'd onboard for such a interaction?
I think it'd be in the millions. Like it would be huge. Like it's a significant customer base that we'd be talking about here, and just like it would be a huge population of people that would suddenly gain access to it overnight. And it's just, and that was just on one use case, and that was the coolest thing, was they were very much starting on like the low hanging fruit. And I think part of the bit that I'm really excited for is like, what are the unexpected parts that are going to come through? Like, what is the microwave coming out of space travel of like SSI? Like, that's the bit that I'm waiting to see.
Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
Well, I just think this is kind of like a good kind of like segue into where you guys are at currently with what you guys are building and where you guys are headed in the near to short term. But just before we did head down that sort of route, I just wanted a quick question. So we talk about the fact that we're, returning data to the individual and in their control and stuff. Do you see a big pain point in this industry moving forward with self-custody? Because I know, there's a lot of people who mishandle, crypto funds. I think it's a big topic in crypto is, a lot of people don't feel comfortable or well educated enough to protect themselves with self-custody. Do you think that if people have to self-custody important data, that we have maybe, a spike in, people attacking this new vulnerability? Perhaps my ignorance is lost a little bit on the details, but it seems like that could be
like a phishing attack, right?
Right. Yeah. If everyone's got to look after themselves on their, on their phone or something like that, does that open like a new attack vector and stuff like that? I think it could be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that's actually come up a lot. And I think that there's a couple of things to kind of like a couple of strands to go down. I think the first is that like SSI really is about returning the control to the user, and one of the potential mechanisms to do that is actually returning control, but not necessarily returning the like hosting of the data. And that's where there are multiple providers kind of looking to step into that. And some of them could be banks. And that's one of the options where actually, or other custody providers could step in and say, like, if you don't want to, and you don't want it on your device, and you don't want it entirely under your control and security, like, we will look after it for you. However, it will effectively look a lot like your mobile banking. Like, you will just have complete access to share your data around as you see fit. But the actual application itself will be kind of maintained and monitored by a third party. And I think that's where kind of like a lot of like wallet providers and others will step into, is like providing the infrastructure to make it secure and make it safe, and potentially also build it inside existing. So I think that's one strand. Is we talk a lot about like the data being on the device, and I think there's like probably worth separating out like control of the data from host. It's still possible to have both,
Right.
just making sure that we don't create more data silos. But I think the other kind of more interesting stuff is like if we use the T-Mobile example, or like British Airways historically, like you could do one attack against one organization and get like this huge amount of data in one go. And like obviously at that level, it's very, very cost efficient to like go after a massive silo, get a load of data, and then be able to like sell that on the dark web or just reuse it yourself. One of the things with SSI is like you are going to have to start going after individual people. And like one of the challenges there is like that suddenly becomes like kind of cost inefficient, because you're literally having to go like individual by individual to go and get that data. And obviously in banking world, like getting hold of someone's funds is a massive deal. Like you could be talking anywhere between like tens to millions, depending on who that individual is. Whereas getting someone's personal data, like you can go through that process, but you're still like, you've got to even go further to then do the bank side of stuff.
Right.
I think the final strand that I'd touch on just really briefly is like when that data moves into a trusted format and it can only be accepted in a trusted format, like control of it becomes much more paramount, and the ability to like defraud people becomes a lot more difficult. So like to put a tangible example, like if I give like Alex all of his trusted data, and someone starts going after Alex, or they go after kind of one of the organizations that he shared that data with, they'll be able to get a copy of his data in clear, in kind of text, but they won't be able to get the kind of digitally signed version that Alex holds or Alex presents.
Right.
And therefore, when they try and use that in another service provider, kind of once it's a bit more like, once the technology is more pervasive, they'll find that that data is useless. It's a difference between going onto an e-commerce website and entering someone else's credit card details and your address, versus like being able to prove that your credit card came from the credit card issuer and your address came from also the credit card issuer at the same time, without being able to kind of type those. So there's like multiple kind of differences and layers of protection. It's definitely like a whole new world. Like, will not deny that at all. I think what's quite interesting is like there's so many different layers that make it a lot more kind of complex and maybe like not cost efficient versus what happens today.
So
I would add something as well.
Go ahead, Alex.
I would say the SSI, well, firstly, the SSI industry as a whole is brilliant. You know, it's full of thought innovators, and they're all looking at these kind of challenges of control, of delegation, of having your credentials backed up into a sort of cloud repository. And secondly, just carrying on from the point Fraser made, your credentials will essentially, if you have a wallet on your phone, be tied to that device. So nobody could really go in and hack them away from your device unless they stole your device. And at that point, you know, it would be just as secure as someone stealing your device and then breaking into your online banking, because they would have to get through all those same levels of, you know, your passcode, maybe your Face ID, to then use your credentials. So in that sense, it is just as secure probably as current online banking, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Like it sounds like SSI massively reduces the attack vector for a lot of malicious actors in this space.
it reduces the attack vector down to you, because with online banking, the attacker can either choose to attack the bank or yourself, whereas it reduces the attack vector because with SSI, the attacker can only attack yourself, but still have to get through the same issues as if they were doing it with banking.
Well, and in
Right.
this case, this is where the potential marriage between SSI and DeFi becomes very apparent, because with online banking, they're still technically the custodians, even if they're interacting with them through a digital API of relationship. Whereas like a DeFi based primitive of digital value, and then these algorithms that handle it, you're still the primary custodian of your assets, and you're just having it being managed for you by this decentralized, censorship resistant algorithm that, again, you have ultimate control over when you can remove from such an algorithm. And so there really does seem to be a huge untapped opportunity of utility here in this sort of digital new world. And I guess I just also want to touch on briefly is like we've touched on how like costs for banks are increasing, and that banks as we know it, the traditional banks, are kind of going away, and how this emergence of this like intermediary, this kind of pseudo custodian of your data, of your DIDs and VCs, will emerge in order to help you manage, in order to provide backstops, and maybe even like a decentralized key management and key recovery systems. Like these sort of institutions will kind of emerge naturally, just as they have for millennia. So it seems that like as along with the emergence of cryptocurrency, this like almost commoditization of identity is kind of emerging, and that we're seeing also, Alex, your concept of entropy is that these units of entropy are being monetized, and that banks of the future are not just handling money, but they're handling monetized data, which is so much more rich than just money in and of itself. Do you think you can speak on that? Is this something a little bit too science fiction? Like, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts.
No, it's a really interesting point, and I do want to pick your brain on that a bit more, actually.
Yeah.
So you're saying that instead of just holding funds, if they're dealing with signed, verified identity data, that is much richer in terms of its utility and its value than just money, which is essentially a social construct.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that with DeFi too. Like money, which can be computed on, produces so much more yield than just money in and of itself, which right now is like actually net negative if you hold it at a bank. It's being detracted from, and so then when you have like money, and there can be various sorts of types, like Bitcoin is the hardest, for example, in the digital world as we know it. We have the CBDCs coming, which we can touch on that in a bit as well. Then we also have like data, which is like a form of a resource which people use every day to feed into algorithms, to serve you advertisements, to God knows what, and that data can be used as a revenue stream as well for platforms. And we've been talking about all this time, all day already, is using that, giving that control back to the user and saying this user can use that data as their own revenue stream as well. Like that's I don't know. I think I could talk about it all day.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a bit of this already with things like, the basic attention token. If you use like Brave browser, for example, and you pick up all of these adverts, you're slowly accumulating your own tokens, which then you can go and donate to a creator or do what you want with. And SSI and the interaction between SSI and DeFi is almost taking that to the next level. It's the same idea as the basic attention token, but instead of you just accessing, it flips it on its head. Because with the basic attention token, your data is still being essentially ripped from you by these companies to be processed, and the basic attention token gives that back to you. But with SSI, you have all the control, you have the verified data, and the companies will pay you money, essentially, to take that from you. So you're going to see a very similar revenue model to that, but with far more opportunity, because you hold the verified data, and that would be so valuable to all these other companies in the ecosystem that not only could the issuers get a revenue stream, but you could begin to monetize your own data yourself to a certain extent.
So
Yeah,
go ahead, Fraser.
No, I think just extending kind of what Alex was putting on there. There's also been this long-term kind of idea that's somewhat linked to SSI, but around like intent casting, and the idea that you can actually like cast an intent out into like the ether and almost do a reverse auction. So a great example would be like, rather than you going on to a comparison website and like going through a bunch of like websites to go and find a car or go and find a house or a mortgage or something, you can effectively reverse it and say, I am Fraser, I have a credit score of X, and prove that using a verifiable credential, but cast that out to the ether and basically say, all of you service providers, all of you like banks, mortgage providers, or like kind of car dealerships, come to me, tell me what the best offer is here, and you can be sure that I have the credit to pay for it. Like you can be sure that I'm like UK national, a bunch of other stuff, but therefore you don't need to kind of go through that kind of KYC process afterwards. Like it's already been done as part of the process, and then you can, like we were saying, flip the auction around and really like improve your user experience to drive the best value. Like the interesting part here is like, will the economics of that stand up where you are like hyper personalizing to individuals? Like, is that actually a thing that is worth kind of chasing as a company? Maybe, maybe not. But it's like a really interesting flip of the dynamics compared to like having to go through comparison websites. And then I think to go.
Well, I just was going to say your analogy goes even further. From what I can tell, is like that's just the first step. Like you're onto something really fundamentally revolutionary, because I've done some thinking about this in the future, and I'm fairly convinced that SSI, along with other like these technologies, it's going to flip even citizenship on its head. We could see a form of liquid democracy emerge, where instead of you going to a country and you applying for citizenship, that like digital nation, so to speak, can come to you and say, oh, we want you to be our citizen, we'll offer you these XYZ services and this XYZ tax rate, or even like a positive tax rate, like you know.
Well, I guess that's kind of what's happening in like some of the areas where they're looking at digital nomadism and providing visas for that. Just like they want to create a tax base, or like they want to increase or like decrease the Canada's a great example, not from the digital nomad perspective, but from a like, they know they need a growing population to like support their tax base and support the pensions and the healthcare that they provide. Therefore, they need like a massive influx of immigration to be able to support it. And like as a result, like they've been really welcoming as a nation, but partly because they're Canadians and super friendly, but also from an economic perspective, like they know that they need that population growth. And I think so. There's going to be that kind of one side of like the Canadian model, but also like I think Cyprus is a great example where they're like, or maybe Finland, offering like digital nomad visas for people to come and stay.
Croatia,
and part of that is like exactly to like bring people, especially people who can work from anywhere. I think we're discovering are typically kind of at least middle income, if not higher, and therefore like do bring spending, do bring kind of taxable benefit. And I think like you're right, it really could flip it on its head and turn it the other way around, which is not something I'd really thought about recently, but is fascinating.
Just great stuff all around. Such like so many possibilities emerge with SSI. Luke, did we lose you in the sauce? Are you still with us?
No, I'm still here. Just listening along. I
Okay.
guess for me, I'd like to steer the ship towards just conscious of time, that's all. I just want to steer the ship towards where you guys are at now, and like what's the roadmap looking like for the next 6 to 12 months? Maybe you could tell us a bit about your testnet, maybe some of the partners and people you're working alongside with, just so we can get a bit more context around, CHEQD as a company and how the network's taking shape at this stage. I think that'd be really handy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll probably cover off everything or most stuff apart from governance, and I'll have to hand over to Alex for that because obviously his area. But I think the main probably items to cover off are like test networks has been live for like close on a month now, I think. And we started that off in like private with ourselves, Outlier Ventures, Evanim, and Didex as well, who've been kind of been really close with us through the entire journey and been really, really helpful, especially both on this and the kind of governance side of things with Alex, who may want to touch on as well. And what we've done recently is kind of open source the tech. And not only because it's public permissionless, not only will that kind of allow anyone to participate and like massively decentralize the network and make sure it's more resilient, but also allow us to kind of like test out the network and make sure that there aren't any bugs that we're finding, make sure that it is really solid, but also like we want this to be as easy as possible to deploy and do that at scale. And I think I might be about to be booted out of a room. But the the other outcome of this is like more recently we started having like really massive inbound adoption more from the like SSI vendor community. Like now that we've started like doing the engagement that Alex is kind of heading up and working with like the likes of Trust Over IP and Diff, like starting to see a lot more kind of recognition of where we're going and how we're doing it and how it's not a little bit, quite a bit different to everything that's come before. So which really kind of brings us on to go on.
I was going to say, I think one of the most important things about how we're going about this is like, we're not trying to screw everyone over. We're trying to take everyone with us. Like with the SSI vendors, they can all plug into our network, building on whatever technology they want, and they can all benefit if they're running a node. So basically, the more credentials that there are in adoption worldwide, the more the entire industry benefits if they're using our network. I think that's really, really powerful. And it's something different. It's, we are anti-competitive in that way. We want to take every single person by the hand and help them along because we love the SSI industry. So while in the past with things like Sovereign, there's been this sort of political divide about how things are being done, the way we're doing things is different. And it's saying like, no, we don't care if you want to build things this way or that way. You can build on whatever open standards you want on top of our network. We will support that. And then you can benefit financially with us all together as a network. So I think, that's part of our strategy.
Yeah, I think it's very much kind of bringing everyone together. And I think that's where the like public permissionless stuff and we'll go on to it in a second, but like the governance work that Alex is doing on really brings it so that there's not like stratified layers of people who control the network and those who participate. Like it is really one kind of, not homogenous, but like one group that can kind of interact together. I guess just before I kind of hand over properly to Alex is more on like the immediate stuff. So obviously with like the test network up, like code open sourced, it's now like bit of a free-for-all for who wants to join, and that's something where kind of Toby Halloran, who just recently joined us as head of partnerships, will start kind of actively working with kind of the rest of the space, like both on like the SSI vendor perspective, but also clients, and also for us like reaching out more into the crypto and DeFi world. So like where can we partner with other organizations to like remove the need for repeat KYC on exchanges, like make the ability to peer-to-peer payments with identity, like make all of that seamless. But really the main focus on us now is like getting the network live and getting the token out there. Like one of the big things for us now is just make it available. We've had enough inbound interest to know that as soon as it's up and running, we're going to see like traffic and volume. So really it's a case of just like getting the network up, getting it live, and getting the token liquid. And then after that, it's in terms of your like next 6 to 12 months, like we're hoping to do that like this fall. And then the period after that is very much going to be a period of iteration. So So we mentioned Alex's minimum viable politics. We've got minimum viable tokenomics on our side, and like it's really like what is the minimum we can do to get the network up and running, and then the position after that will be like what can we then go and build on to go and make it successful. So for us, that's transparently that is like payment mechanisms like verify pays issuer. It is more complex things like subscription models, volume-based discounting. But also, I think to kind of do a bit of a segue into Alex's world, like how do we start making it so that ecosystems can do their governance on Ledger? Like no one should be building their governance from scratch anymore. Like there's enough kind of DAO templates and out there to go and make this almost configurable, at least as far as possible. And I think that's kind of the functionality we want to start bringing on is like not just being another layer one, but really providing value like up in ecosystems above it. So hopefully that's a decent enough segue for Mr. Tweeddale to carry on.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important, and in the public perception of what we're doing is one of the most important things is increasing entropy, and that comes back to something I mentioned earlier. And if we can show that we are not a centralized, company like say Sovereign were, but in fact we are creating a decentralized ecosystem where everyone has as much say as everybody else, using a liquid democracy governance system, which is built into Cosmos, then that goes a long way. And at the same time, the way we're building our governance framework out, instead of creating something which can only be used for checked, we want to build something that can be adopted for other networks going forward. We want to be building templates and just making it really easy and just being transparent with everything. Because there's no point in just doing all this work and then just being like, right, that's ours. It's just like, no, this is a good framework for everybody else to build up in the future.
And I think, Ghost, I saw you twitching, but I think this is something that we spoke about before, which is like why crypto in the DeFi world moves so quickly compared to like other spheres. And it is that like transparency and openness and like the willing to collaborate and open source stuff and work together. Like the fact that like IP is collaboratively contributed rather than like built in silo and in like competitive destruction just means that everything moves so much quicker. And I think that's what we're really appreciating here is like we've only been around since March, but we've already found some amazing people who've just been willing to help. And I think we're starting to kind of already be able to give some of that back to ecosystems who will hopefully like adopt our network. And be able to like make their lives a lot easier and keep that rolling for like everyone who comes down the line. And I think it's kind of that flywheel of innovation thing, and not just on like the network growth, but also the speed that people can adopt it should get quicker and quicker the more tooling that we build out, both on the like commercial side, but also on the governance side, which will all be under Alex.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in here because I just had a really interesting thought. Like, I know we spoke about the KYC problem in crypto, and I know we kind of have a crypto bias, but we're here talking about crypto and networks and stuff like that. But I think one of the major issues right now in the exchange space in particular is the regulatory crackdown. We're seeing KYC on Binance. I think we're going to see pressure like that ramping up globally. I just had a thought, would it be possible to like team up with MetaMask and then have it so that, your checked verifiable identity and identifiers can be linked to your MetaMask wallet. And then whenever you interact with like a DeFi protocol or you go onto an exchange with your MetaMask wallet and stuff like that, your KYC and credentials are, verifiably signed to your wallet. I think that would just be like an instant extension to MetaMask that would probably get you, millions of users overnight. I think that would just be such a cool avenue.
It's massively in our thinking, I think. The overlap between verifiable credentials and DeFi, I mean, that's one of the main things that stands out is like, can you actually reduce fraud and, all of these problems within DeFi by having linked through people to each transaction? So yes, that is something we're definitely thinking about. I think it's a bit too early right now. We need to wait for credentials to be flooded into the market. And we're doing that by our incentivized SSI network. So stage 1 is build the network. Stage 2 is get adoption of credentials and begin the sort of the incentivized flywheel. And then stage 3 is look at how we can plug things like basically the criminality within cryptocurrency using verifiable credentials and linking it to things like MetaMask.
And go on, Ghost.
Oh, I just wanted to briefly, because I think we've been skirting around this for this entire time. We've talked about what basically amounts to interoperability across domains, across platforms, interoperability of the real world and the virtual world, and I think then it naturally leads us to this sort of CDFI concept that recently you all sponsored a paper of with Unison. Can you speak into like how the intermixing of centralized finance and decentralized finance can be facilitated by SSI? Is that something that is a utility use case for CHEQD?
Yeah, and interestingly, like we see it as almost symbiotic because we think we actually need CDFI to achieve like what we need to in SSI and what we're doing at CHEQD. So if I start that way around, then I'll come around to like how it facilitates the other way around. So like ultimately for SSI, where we want to get to is like, yes, there needs to be a value flow that surrounds it and like turbocharges it and makes it commercially viable. But we don't want people to have to worry about crypto to do that. Like we want to be completely kind of global, like cross-industry, cross-tech, cross-country. And really the only way of doing that is making it so that money comes in one side in whatever format you want and it goes out the other side in whatever format you want. And I think that's really the principle of like CDFI, is just like this complete like spectrum of finance and being able to interact with it in almost any way that you want, large and likely being a mix. And for what that means for us in terms of the SSI world is that like we've written a paper on, or like a really quick blog on like why SSI needs a token. Broadly speaking, it's that if I give Alex's data, I don't know where he's going to use it. So therefore, how could wherever uses it possibly know my bank details and make sure that all of that works out? But ultimately, for like most of the enterprises that will likely adopt this longer term, like they won't want to be natively holding tokens. Like your guy who has a bottle or an off license, like should not have to worry about how he holds tokens to be able to pay for like identity checks inside his store. Like he just wants to know that it's done and some money disappears out of an account. And ultimately, that's where we want to get to, is like money disappears in one side and just appears on the other side without any concern for how it got there. And so for one of the potential items there is like wrapping up the like receipt of data with like taking a really quick payment in fiat, converting that on an exchange to tokens, using a custodian if needed to like remove the need for anyone to hold those tokens, fire them across the network to like the issue of the data in the first place, and then the issue of the data can effectively back that out to fiat if they wanted to, like using another exchange of their choice. Or even like when we go into multiple ledgers, being able to bridge between two protocols by having, say, a liquidity pool in the middle. So actually the payment is routing, but it's moving from one token on one side to another, and still appearing out the other side as if no one needed to know what happened. So I think like that's where CDFI is going to have like a massive impact on SSI. Is like, yeah, I realistically need both to be successful. I think on the flip side, where like SSI can power CDFI, I think there's like obviously the KYC stuff that we've spoken ad nauseum, both on like the centralized exchange and DEXs. But I think it also comes into things like peer-to-peer payments. So when we've been taking in investment, every single person's been like, here's a first payment, and it's always like $10 in USDC, and then it's followed up by the balance, and that's always because no one trusts who's on the other side in like DeFi payments and peer-to-peer payments. Whereas in like if we layer on SSI, we can actually share something that's as basic as like a Telegram handle, or it could be like a passport, or it could be anything. And yeah, no one outside of the two people on that kind of that channel would actually know anything about the two individuals. And I think that's where like you suddenly like massively empower trust. I think to probably more impactful is the ability to have like fully KYC'd collateralized loan pools without needing to know anything about any of the people inside that group. Like you could effectively use zero knowledge proofs to like the entire KYC process, so that you know that they've met certain criteria to be inside that pool, but you actually don't need to know everyone's name and date of birth. And I think this could be a really cool way of like, if it's done properly, show how like traditional industry can start doing KYC in a way that is like incredibly private, but also to a really high barrier that regulators will accept. And also without then having the organization have the reputational like risk of having to then hold that data afterwards after they've done that check. So there's like a lot of that. It's really symbiotic, but there's so much opportunity on both sides to make both of them really successful.
Mm-hmm. That's like, there's so many different use cases you just enumerated right there. One of which, Luke, I'm sure it reminded you of interchange, quants interchange as well.
Yeah.
Did it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just a market need at this point.
Absolutely.
I think it's kind of blowing my mind actually, like some of these use cases. If I'm being completely honest.
Yeah.
I think this is the slightly dangerous thing of like combining SSI with DeFi is just like, it is endless possibility, and it's just figuring out like where is the most value that needs to be nailed off to make this work out. Like there are so many different ideas, so many different ways of structuring this stuff. Like one of the ones that we've spoken about for a long time is like, once you get a recurring revenue stream for identity, why wouldn't you tokenize that and create a secondary market for it? So the idea that you could actually like front run finance using your own identity, and obviously that's not going to be as big as like securitizing a mortgage. Like it's not going to have like that size in terms of market, but it's still a substantial revenue stream over someone's lifetime. And I could, especially if you're like, you become a celebrity and therefore actually parts of your identity are like significantly valuable, like your signature, like you can suddenly start creating really interesting models for like how you monetize identity. And I think one of the areas that we've not even touched on, which is weird given the current hype, is NFTs, and being able to prove like provenance, prove ownership, but also prove like extension of that, of being able to move it, like the idea of having an NFT that you can move across multiple online games or something, and be able to prove that it's you every single time. So much opportunity there.
We've got something very exciting in the pipeline around not exactly NFTs, but can we give it away on this, Fraser, or are we keeping it secret?
So we've still got to keep that one secret, unfortunately. It's one of those cases.
There's the tease for you guys. If you've listened this far, you've got a little tease.
Maybe you can
join our Telegram group to find out more. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there it is.
I think it's a testament to how interesting this conversation was that we didn't just go for the low-hanging fruit of NFTs. Let's talk about that. Because DIDs and VCs essentially are NFTs in and of themselves. And the promise of NFTs, I think, only really becomes substantial when they're incorporated into DID VC enabled ecosystems. And like I was just thinking, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. I think like when you can start proving like ownership and provenance in like a repeatable, like interoperable way, like that's going to be massive.
Huge.
Like you only need to see the number of stories of like how many Picassos have been put on like online portals and online marketplaces, despite obviously not being by him and not being owned. So like I think that's where it's going to get really cool longer term. And one thing that I think was in the CDFI paper, I think it was like less in finance, but more in like content distribution, and the idea that you could use something like IPFS and SSI and like Filecoin and CHEQD and a blend of all of these things to do like entirely distributed but controlled content distribution. So the idea that you wouldn't actually need like a middleman in the form of something like Netflix, you could literally just pipe content out using something like Popcorn Time, and yet be able to monetize the content at the same time would be super cool.
I mean, you Popcorn Time, I haven't heard that in a long time, but that service is amazing. So amazing. But you actually read my mind. I was thinking about like, Patreon. A lot of YouTubers use Patreon as like a early entry into their videos. And like if let's say this is like, I don't know, PewDiePie, right? And you have a way to like get early access to some of his videos and his data stream of the workflows, like that'd be such an interesting way to have like an open distribution platform where you can monetize the content that you're producing without depending on ads or depending on traditional platforms in order to do so. Like,
Well, I think the other extension of that is like the beauty that in like this decentralized world, you actually own the platform yourself.
mhm,
Like because you typically own like the tokens running across the network, like you are part of the value accrual of that platform and the network.
mhm,
The analogy I've been using for, like recently is like it's almost like moving the IPO like point of a company to like as early as humanly possible to get like ownership into like the public,
mhm.
so that they own most of the growth and own most of like the increase. And I think that's one of the benefits. Like if we did go to this like fully decentralized network for distribution or decentralized platform for distribution, like the fact that the creators would also like probably own the underlying currency that supports it means that they're actually like not like when they're paying, like if I don't know what the percentages are on like YouTube, but instead of like paying their 20-30% 50% to like YouTube, yes, they're paying a percentage that goes onto the network, but actually part of that is coming back to themselves, and they're actually seeing value of being part of that network in the first place.
Mhm.
I think that could be so powerful because you're just completely democratizing and distributing like the ownership, not just of the content, but also the like underlying distribution platform.
Beautiful. I think
Essentially just removes the need for any middleman in anything because you could just use the network for it.
mhm. Well, there's a decentralized
Yeah.
middleman, and this kind of gets
Well,
to
absolutely.
like the concept of like I think it's going to take. I don't think this is yet sunk in for a lot of people, but like the trust triangle is in essence a representation of what is called triple entry accounting, where you have two counterparties and then a third party providing verification of the authenticity of the either exchange of goods or in this case data between the two. And this sort of the service really isn't real or isn't effective until we have like autonomous systems like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, like Checked, that can provide such independent, uh, preferably politically like uninterrupted services, to peers as they see fit and as they need. Um, so there's just so much there. It's like we said, we could get lost in the sauce we could talk for hours. How has your time been with Outlier Ventures?
Oh, incredible. Like they've just been amazing. I think we're quite lucky in the like because of the history of the project, and you kind of touched on it with Sovereign. Like we've had a really strong relationship with Outlier. They've like obviously from Jamie's post and stuff, like there's been a long-term history there and long-term backing. But also like they've really kind of rallied around us to go make this a success. Like they were obviously one of the biggest early champions of SSI needing a token, quite rightly, and I think are just like really kind of enthusiastic about finally seeing reality. So they've just been unbelievable. Like everything that I guess to be a bit transparent, like I historically been involved in Accenture's FinTech Innovation Lab, and we always found that the best startups or the startups that did the best were the ones who demanded the most. Like there's a saying from like North England, which is like shy bairns getting out, which is basically children who don't ask don't get. And we discovered like myself and Anchor were both involved, but we discovered that basically like startups that don't ask for anything don't get anything. So the best thing to do was just demand as much as possible, and like assume that you'll get maybe 50% of it actually resolved and back. And I think what's been fantastic with Outlier is like that's like it's been drastically higher than 50%. Like it's probably very, very close to 100%. Like we've like really demanded a lot, and they've been amazing throughout. So for anyone who is listening and is considering like applying, I couldn't recommend it more. Like Stefan, Jamie, and like Chris and the team are absolutely fantastic. They're like know the industry inside out, but also extremely pragmatic on like the best route forwards. It's been completely invaluable to have them on the team, and have them pushing us forwards. It helps that they like don't do bullshit. Like they'll just tell you how it is. And I think that was really, really helpful for me up front. Like, coming from corporate world and moving into like crypto and DeFi space, it's like not an area that I historically knew much about. And they were really just like straightforward, like you need to do this, like less words on slides, less consulting, and did that very, very quickly, which was massively helpful for me. But they've done even more for like CHEQD as a company.
Beautiful. So as well, I mean, remember you all talking about previously the Trust Over IP Foundation, the DIF, just all these legacy connections, and not even to speak about Evernym. I mean, good Lord, Evernym being involved with IATA, Gleef, the NHS, the list goes on and on. The potential network adoption for CHEQD is incredible. Can perhaps Alex, would you mind speaking of like your interactions with the likes of Drummond Reed and the Trust Over IP Foundation? How is that going? Do you think that perhaps propagating your governance modules through them is possible?
Absolutely, this is something that we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks. I've been working with Drummond, and for those who don't know who he is, he's a pioneer. He's sort of known as the godfather of SSI
along with Samuel
many.
Along with Samuel Smith, of course. But yes.
Well, there's a few of them. The Godfathers, Godfather 1, 2, and 3.
Uh-huh.
And we've been just talking about decentralized governance, and how it's differentiated from what's been done before in the identity space. Going into things like Trust Over IP, it's a fantastic community because everyone's so open to just working together to make this technology work for everyone. And there's so many brilliant initiatives, like within the utility foundry working group that we're going to be joining. There's a big shout out to Yoma, who are doing fantastic things with children in Africa, giving them identities and giving them verified education records. And there's just really, really cool initiatives going on all over Trust Over IP. So we are getting involved into the utility foundry working group, which basically means as a layer 1 network, we're going to get people together into a working group to help build out our decentralized governance framework. Also, which is really, really cool. I just love the idea of people who, don't work for the company, but are just really passionate about the industry collaborating together. And part of that is we're going to give back what we do in the governance world as templates, as things that people can work off in the future for their own projects. And then with DIF at the same time, I absolutely love what they're doing in terms of interoperability, pushing for interoperable technical standards. And I think as CHEQD as a company, we wholly support that. A few years ago, the identity industry was sort of fragmented in the sense of like, there were multiple different companies who wanted to build things in different ways. And I think that was part of the naivety of the time. It was like, right, we have this fantastic idea of SSI. And then everyone was like, okay, we need to build it this way. This is the best way. This is, and then someone on the other side of the spectrum would have a completely different way of building it, and these two wouldn't interoperate. But what DIF's doing is it's trying to quash all of that and build these really fantastic open and interoperable standards that everyone can use. So I think we can harness both Trust Over IP for its brilliant work in what it's doing on the governance side, and Diff for its brilliant work on interoperable standards, and hopefully harmonize the two initiatives and get people who are working on both sides to join CHEQD and the work we're doing here.
So I just want to briefly say something about the commonality between the two entities you were saying, Alex, about how potentially trust over IP being an information-based protocol exchange. Then you have like the DIF and how they're doing standards. It seems as well that like with the likes of Overledger and Quant, they're facilitating this thing called ODAP, which is Open Digital Asset Protocol, which is a means of exchanging value and has a bunch of people, like very important people like MIT, like Juniper, all these different people backing it. It seems as well that like identity has its own identity protocol exchange mechanism, which is by the aforementioned Samuel Smith called Carry. Can you speak on Carry or what what promises there in that protocol, and if CHEQD is looking at adopting it, if at all?
So Carry is really interesting. It's an alternative to blockchain, I would say. The technical worms of how it works are probably for our CTO Anchor, if anyone, because I think only Samuel Smith in the world probably fully understands how it works. It's sort of in its infancy at the moment. Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's not even a alternative to blockchain. It's very complementary in my eyes. It basically just allows for individuals to manage their own revocation logs and their own interaction logs, and then to also have as many or as few secondary sources, that being DLTs. It could be centralized intermediaries. It could be kind of other peers help manage those key event receipts. And so that in essence is what it starts. And I think via it we can see the like in essence like the ionization of identity, like away from like kind of like how the banks, they don't really want people to transfer back and forth because of cost. Well, but protocols and these sort of technological revolutions, they reduce the cost so much more and push it to the end user such that it allows them to facilitate the transfer and ownership of this identity even more. And so Carry, I think, potentially could allow even more opportunity for like SSI adoption, like for the likes of CHEQD, because of CHEQD's tokenization, the robust game theory that underlies it, and the substantial just sheer utility that CHEQD can bring to the table.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of ultimately where we think it'll end up as well. Like there was a long conversation a while back of like where we were looking at what platform to use and like how to start structuring stuff. And one of the big debates was like, do we go for something which is like entirely token native, like Cosmos is, or like Polkadot? And then like, actually, does it make sense to have like the DIDs on the net? Like, do they have to be on the network as well? And broadly what we came down to was like, right now it's highly preferable because you can link up like identity transactions and like payments like a lot more tightly coupled. But there was definitely like an acknowledgement that it doesn't have to be that way, and the DIDs and all the data can be elsewhere. But there's still kind of a need for an underlying payment mechanism, and an underlying way of like doing kind of decentralized governance and decentralized commercial models. And I think that's where like it really boils it down to the trust that even if you've got the data moving across separate rails, like you still need a way of like governing that and like commercializing that and be able to pay people
and computing it too.
Exactly, and I think that's where like it goes back to our theory of like, or our theory, which is why kind of CHEQD exists, which is like SSI is a great new paradigm, but it can't be like, if it's a technology without a commercial model, then it will be the only identity that's ever existed without a commercial model behind it, which just shows that it needs one. And I think that's kind of where we're coming from. It's like there's always going to have to be this underlying kind of organizational structure that comes from somewhere, and the kind of commercial modeling and the payments need to root from somewhere. And I think that's where longer term, like when obviously we're starting off on Cosmos, we absolutely believe that it's going to be completely cross ledger. Like it's got to be to go and make this work out. Like we can't create another silo. So it has to be like eventually like bridging. And it's just making sure that we kind of build that in a way that and like you were saying, kind of teaming up at the start, like that could well involve like having Kerry as the data exchange layer, and then using kind of ourselves to do the kind of organization and the actual underlying payments, especially across multiple systems. That's where it gets really fascinating. Not just transactional payments, but like specific ecosystems and how they commercialize data. They're all different. They're all going to kind of facilitating. I think that's where like, yeah, it's longer term. It's going to be a case of like best of breed, best of breed technology to go and merge this stuff together.
Mm-hmm. It definitely seems like CHEQD 2.0 is leaning towards this like this post-platform sort of approach, where the data, as you're saying, is like it's agnostic to where it's stored, but the logic for the transversal and the coupling of the value with the data is ultimately what CHEQD is uniquely focused on securing.
Well, if you look at it from a commercial perspective, you talked about like identity being commoditized, and a great example of that is just the price drop you've seen in like KYC costs like over the past couple of years. Like, it has dropped. And I think if you look inside like SSI and authentic data world, like the thing that's commoditized right now is like the storage of DIDs. Like it's a very like it's a thing that you can do in multiple places. It's the same with like schemas, cred defs. Like it's almost a race to the bottom because they are standardized, and as long as you support it, like you could do it on something as simple as a database or QLDB from AWS, or like there's even talk of like DIDs in websites, that kind of stuff. So I think like that side of things is becoming very, very like still evolving, but becoming more and more commoditized from a value perspective. Whereas the really big missing parts are like payments, commercial models, and governance, because those are the bits that are not solved right now in any kind of format, and they need building out to make it successful. So yeah, I think go back to that, like really not tightly coupled from a technology perspective, but like tightly coupled from make it all successful. Is it has to be kind of loose on the technology side, but focusing on where the actual value is, and hopefully we've got that right in terms of strategy.
I think a key reason why I'm so excited about this is, you guys talk about the trust triangle. It's kind of the perfect example of a circular economy in the crypto ecosystem. Like every single person in the wheel or the triangle, as you guys say, has something to benefit, and I think that really like kickstarts like the network effects into like a massive snowball really fast, because you've got everyone along the chain incentivized to take part, and I can't wait to see that in action. That's gonna be so cool.
But I guess just to like one thing we probably should have mentioned before, and like maybe people have already like picked up and understood it, but inside that the roles inside the triangle are like they're somewhat false, because they kind of assign a role to people and assume that they only have one place in that triangle. And the reality is actually that almost every individual and every organization is going to sit across the three different areas, whether they're an issuer, a verifier receiver, or a holder. Like there are going to be few instances where like an organization is only an issuer. Like it's likely that they're also going to be a receiver. They're also going to be a holder. And it means, like, to your point around the circle, like everyone is getting value out of it, and it really should spin quicker, because there's going to be more revenue. Like, assuming that you kind of sit across like three places on that kind of triangle, you're issuing data to someone, which means you get revenue. You're taking data in from someone else, which means you get to drop your costs. You're also holding that data, which means that like your operations become more efficient. So like regardless of where you are, like you are benefiting. And the reality is like most people in organizations are going to be across all three. So I think that's like, I think it sometimes gets lost in like the terminology that it's like, yes, people have these roles, but also everyone will almost be all three. And therefore, like, they really should be accruing the maximum possible value from being part of the ecosystem. I think it's just worth calling out because sometimes it gets lost in like the terminology that we use to describe people,
Right.
an organization.
Fraser, that's advanced SSI base. This is advanced SSI. I mean, we're just introducing a lot of people to SSI, and then you're saying everything you know is wrong. So
That's pretty much what happens when you get deep enough into anything. You know,
it's true.
So all that basic
Very
stuff, forget it. We're getting into quantum now, quantum SSI.
Everything you know is wrong. I guess you could consider the trust triangle as like less of like people are that and that alone, like I'm only a verifier, and more about like the three different types of masks or roles you can wear, like internal characteristics rather than external identifiers, so to speak.
The classic which hat am I wearing in a business context?
Yeah.
Like exactly that.
And that is SSI.
I think there's
that is SSI.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that like there's one other point there around like I think expressions of SSI. Like some people worry that like once you're inside that world, you can only ever express one identity. Like you can only ever be one thing. Like inside SSI, like there's still this concept of like you can have dual passports, you can have multiple citizenships, like you can even have like different expressions of identity depending on like where you're interacting. Yes, some of those might not be with trusted data, but like you can still have very different like expressions of yourself to different spheres. I think that's worth like just mentioning at the end. It's another one of those like, yes, like ideally trusted data is like an authentic data is like where everything is coming from, but there's still the route to like express yourself in different ways and position yourself like very much follow like Ready Player One of like be whoever you want to be if you want to be, but obviously the flip side of that is you then still need to meet the requirements of the side for whatever services you're after. So it's all like such a blend of like expression versus requirements.
I think we might be at a stopping point. I'm sure Alex, someone here probably needs to use the restroom. I definitely do myself. So we can postpone all these great discussions till next time. Luke, did you have any final closing thoughts?
No, basically from my side, just thank you guys for coming on the channel, and talking through what you guys are building. It's exciting, and as we said, we'll definitely have to get up for round 2, maybe round 3 further down the line. Maybe bring on some some other players in the space or some partners you guys are working with, and make it a real roundtable. That could be cool. But yeah, from me, basically, thank you for sharing the juice. It was awesome.
It's so good.
Thanks for having us, especially for what's been up to 2 hours. So it's been great. It's been great to just ramble on and get through something like you were saying before, Luke. Like, it's such an exciting space, and just there's so much opportunity, so many combinations that are out there. It's going to be incredible to see how it develops.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, big thank you to you guys both as well for giving us the time to ramble, and big thank you to everyone who's listened up to this point. You've made it.
Yes.
Don't worry, we're going to post highlights and choice clips because there's so many. There's so much content in this video. So thank you all for coming.
Absolutely.
Thanks all.
Right. Cheers, guys.
Thank you. All right. See you later.
See you later.